Alright, let's do this. Welcome to Confrontational History, is a YouTube channel where we take on bad historical myths and narratives, and also where I spend hundreds of hours playing Grand Tactician, War of Rights, and Victoria 3 instead of making videos. Hey, it's primary research. Anyway, this is going to be a long promised video on Civil War tactics, and this piece of awful bad history schlock is what finally compelled me to go ahead and do this video. As I start recording this episode now, we are in the first week of September 2024. If you were to go back fourscore years ago from today to the United States, you would see the armies in both major theaters engaged in trench warfare around Richmond and Petersburg and also Atlanta. And for a lot of people, it amazes them that we did not come to this place sooner. Now, when you learn about the American Civil War in your high school history classes, you're often given the impression that the reason the Civil War was fought the way it was because of stupidity. The common phrase is that tactics had not yet advanced to the level of military and industrial technology. And if you look at any sort of media that's based around the time period of the Civil War, whether that's movies or TV shows or even some documentaries that are supposed to come from reputable sources, this is the impression that you're given. Now, I like to put my thesis right up at the front of the video. The problem during the American Civil War was not that tactics did not keep up with advancements in weapons technology. The problem during the Civil War is that communications technology did not keep up with advancements in weapons technology. And the needs of communication, of coordinating these vast armies from the very largest units to the very smallest units, is what motivated the tactical decisions that were made during the Civil War. Now, as I'd said before, modern media often gives a false impression of what it was like to be on a Civil War battlefield. And the needs of narrative, the need to be able to allow the audience to follow what's going on the battlefield and focus on key commanders and their grand speeches about Virginia or, about whatever else they want to talk about, that supersedes the need to portray military combat during the Civil War in an accurate way. But of course, real battle is not like that which is portrayed in these movies. Real battle was the antithesis of that. I think that it was Atunche Films who once said that every single Civil War battle would have been like the Normandy landing scene from Saving Private Ryan. Glory is one movie that I think does a very good job with its portrayal of Civil War combat, especially in that opening scene in Antietam. Now, they get a few of the other major details wrong in that scene, but in terms of portraying the desperation and the violence and the confusion of a battlefield, they do all of that very well. I've linked a legal clip of that scene in the description of this video, and I invite you to go and check it out to get an idea of what I'm talking about. I want to warn you, it's very violent, so if you want to avoid that for any reason, then just avoid it. But as I said, it does a great job of setting up what I'm talking about here. So I'm entering this in post. A few days before the release of this video, while I was working on it, the channel Brandon F. actually released a full analysis specifically of this battle scene. And I promise you, I wasn't stealing his idea. This is something I had in mind from long before I even actually started recording this in my notes as something to reference. But his video and his analysis is very good, and I also recommend you go and check that out. Anyway, back to the main video. And if you view all of that we're talking about from this context, then you can see why it was so difficult to maintain communication and coordination on a Civil War battlefield. Now, you may check out that scene and say, okay, but this whole going in shoulder to shoulder thing, like, you can look at the massacre. That's why all of this is so stupid. But if you understand that context again, and you're looking at what's going on in that scene and thinking about it, how are you going to communicate? If someone's standing 100 feet away from you or further, how are you going to be able to get a command? You have to remember, this is a time before radios. This is a time before cell phones. This is a time before GPS. They don't even have the very highly detailed gridded maps that our soldiers carried into the Second World War. If you wanted to communicate something to somebody else, you had three options. You had either shouted orders, vocal orders, there were bugle calls, or you could follow the flag. Either your regimental standard, which is the flags that you always see them carrying into battle, or sometimes there were signal flags, but those were really your only way to get orders across. And so if you can't see it and you can't hear it, how are you going to know it? As insane as it seems to us today, keeping men together in close formation was really the only way to appropriately coordinate and get orders across in the battlefield. You had to be able to make sure that guys were close enough that they could hear you, or at least hear some sort of command. And so there is a certain logic to it if you understand the context of what was going on. And of course, if a command was very poorly worded, or wasn't transmitted in time, or was not suited to the realities of what was actually on the battlefield, then disasters would occur. And I'll certainly get into plenty of examples of that later on. But I think to understand these issues of command and communication and coordination, it helps understand how these armies were actually structured. Now, platoons and squads did exist during the Civil War, but for the most part, they weren't tactically viable units. These are mostly your messmates or the guys you made camp with, but they didn't tend to function on their own in battlefield situations. The smallest tactically viable unit in most situations was the company. A company was usually commanded by a captain who was assisted by a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant, and oftentimes a sergeant major, in order to get orders out. But if you are the average soldier on a Civil War battlefield, most of your orders are coming from your captain. A captain was not just responsible for filtering the orders that were coming up from him, but the captain was also responsible for making immediate tactical decisions on the battlefield. Where to deploy soldiers, how to deploy soldiers, where to fire, how to set distance for firing, all that other stuff. That came down to the captain. Now, oftentimes, there would be a designated skirmish company within a regiment, and I'll explain what a regiment here is in a bit. But the skirmish company would oftentimes be sent forward, detached from the rest of the regiment, in order to either act as a speed bump for advancing enemies, a scout ahead, or sometimes guard the flanks. And a captain who was in charge of the skirmish company had to be able to independently make command decisions in a way that is very similar to small unit tactics in modern armies. And oftentimes in the confusion of battle, companies would get meshed in together. Officers who were higher up than the captain would be killed or wounded, and then the captain would have to take over a higher command. And so captains were oftentimes responsible for making all these important decisions and managing the real battlefield situation at any given time. Now, 3 to 5 companies would usually be organized into a battalion. A battalion usually was commanded by a major, and a major was responsible for both taking orders from the people higher up from him, but also coordinating the activities of all of the companies that were under his command and issuing orders to his captains. And then 2 to 3, usually 2, battalions were organized into a regiment. Now, most of the most famous units of the war were regiments. The 20th Maine, the Pennsylvania Bucktails, the Louisiana Tigers, those were all regiments. A regiment usually, ideally, had about 1,000 men in it starting out at the war. But in reality, oftentimes, this was as low as 300 to 400 men once the regiment had been in combat for about a year or so. A regiment was usually commanded by a colonel, and he was oftentimes assisted by a lieutenant colonel, and he would be responsible for getting orders down to his battalions and sometimes companies if the chain of command failed in some way. Now, in the Federal Army, usually 3 to 4. In the Confederate Army, usually 4 to 5 regiments were organized into a brigade. Ideally, a brigade was commanded by a brigadier general, and the brigadier general was responsible for getting orders from his higher-ups, but also distributing orders down to all of his regiments. Then 3 to 4 in the Federal Army, again 4 to 5 in the Confederate Army, brigades were organized into a division. A division ideally was commanded by a major general in both armies. Then, again, same structure, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. Brigades, or rather divisions, were often organized into a corps. In the Confederate Army, a corps was usually commanded by a lieutenant general. In the Union Army, it was still usually a major general. Then multiple corps made an army. And the army on the Confederate side was usually commanded by just the general, sort of the precursor to the 4-star rank that is now in the United States Army. But up until after the Battle of Gettysburg, your Army commander was also a major general on the Federal side. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the lieutenant general rank was created in the Federal Army, and usually Army commanders were lieutenant generals after that point, but they were all major generals before that. This caused some confusion and overlapping and resentment that kind of handicapped the Federal Army for a lot of the war until the command structure was made more clear. But that's sort of the general structure of these armies. So you have an army is organized into corps are organized into divisions are organized into brigades are organized into regiments are organized into battalions are organized into companies, and all the way down. Something that's helpful to think about is that while an officer may have responsibility over the lives of thousands or even tens of thousands of people, in reality, he's only responsible for command and coordination and communication with about 3 to 5 other people. So those are the people that he's actually giving orders to. And then when you look at this structure from the army down, in terms of how orders are being enacted and how the fighting and communication, coordination, and command actually run, army are not comprised of corps. They're not comprised of divisions. They're not just the big lump of tens of thousands of men. In reality, an army is about 700 to 900 individual companies. So just keep that in mind. Think about that when we're going ahead. But in the absence of rapid, long-range communications, with this structure, with this need to be able to transmit orders all the way up and down this chain of command, you can kind of get a sense of why the thinking was that we have to keep our guys as close together as possible and we can't spread them out. But now that we have an idea of how these armies were structured, let's talk about some of the misconceptions regarding the capabilities of Civil War weaponry. When you look at the statistics regarding the effective firing range of rifled musketry during the Civil War, oftentimes these weapons are said to be effective up to 500 yards. The Springfield and the Enfield or the main combat weapons of the war. And on paper, as I said, their effective firing range is up to 500 yards. So, my God, you would have to be completely insane to go up to 100 yards and fire these things at each other if they're effective so much further out than that. And then, the meme says that the Whitworth rifle was effective out to a range of 1,500 yards. And maybe a very skilled marksman could make that shot, but not with that ridiculous scope. The scopes that they were using back then were far cruder. But the effective firing range of a weapon is limited to the effectiveness of the individual soldier who is carrying it. And Civil War armies simply were not trained to be able to fire their muskets at those kinds of ranges. Much like today, Civil War rifles had adjustable sights, so you could adjust your sights based off of the distance that you wanted the bullet to travel. But they weren't firing a modern NATO round. A modern AR-15 fires at a relatively flat trajectory up until about 350 yards from the point where it's initially fired. The Civil War rifles use much heavier rounds that were called mini balls, or mini bullets, more technically. But these were, as I said, far heavier than a NATO round. They also were not as aerodynamic, and the powder charge that was used to fire them was a lot weaker than what you have in a modern rifle. Civil War rifles were sighted in at 100 yards. So in order to fire a shot on the trajectory that the rifle was set at, you couldn't be more than about 100 yards away. Anything more than that, you had to adjust your sights. But then you had to account for trajectory, and you also had to be able to make an accurate assessment of how far away the enemy was from your position to get that trajectory correct. As you can imagine, this wasn't easy. This took a lot of experience, and it took specific drilling and training to be able to do this. Now, every Civil War regiment had guys who were skilled marksmen in the regiment, but marksmanship was not the priority of most Civil War training. And that may seem a little weird, but you have to remember that a lot of these guys are being brought in from civilian life. They're volunteers. They'd never been soldiers before. These weren't professional European armies. To turn them into any type of effective soldiers, you have to drill concepts and understandings of tactics into their heads that they wouldn't have been familiar with in their civilian life. And you have to consider what loading one of these weapons was actually like. Loading a Civil War rifle was a process in and of itself. You had to first discharge the round, then you had to set your gun to half cock, then you had to pull your new round, out of your sack, tear the cartridge, pour the powder down the barrel, put the bullet into the barrel, get out your ramrod, ram the bullet down the barrel, then go back, put the firing cap onto the hammer, onto the nipple, under the hammer, I should say, go to full cock, aim, fire, then repeat. A well-trained Civil War soldier was expected to be able to do this 3 times a minute. Now, some guys were able to do it 4 times a minute. Some guys were even able to do it 5 times a minute. But 3 times a minute was the expected standard. And you have to be able to do all of this while shells are flying over your head, guys are getting shot beside you, explosions are happening all over the battlefield, and paying attention to orders that are coming from your officers and properly executing those orders. So, as I said, marksmanship, not exactly the priority. Again, the movie Glory does a really good job of showing how training was actually conducted during the Civil War and what they were training for. Gods in General sometimes gets credit for its good training scenes, but again, I think Glory does a better job. That's just an opinion, but, that's my opinion. So to be an effective soldier the way that they needed you to be did not include marksmanship as the highest priority. The highest priority was getting these guys to be able to do all of these things while remaining calm and listening for new orders to come in. Now, there are innumerable examples of guys messing this up during the Civil War. If you've ever heard the expression going off half-cocked, that comes from times that guys would be in the field and they would reload their musket and forget to set their rifle back to full cock on the hammer. So they would squeeze the trigger, nothing happens. But oftentimes they're in such a panicked state that they don't realize that nothing has happened. So they would reload again, repeat the process, nothing happens, reload again, and then they would just repeat this until finally they remember to do it correctly and their gun would blow up in their face. Or sometimes if they were fortunate enough, they would remember, they would catch themselves in time, but then their rifle was useless. There are also examples of guys who would fire their ramrods at the enemy because they didn't execute the fundamentals of being a soldier properly. And of course, once you fired the ramrod, you're useless as a soldier because you can't load your weapon anymore. But the point is that you had this training deficit that kept the guys from being as effective as they might have been at these long ranges. But they were effective at the ranges that they were trained at. That's something they consider as the geography of the battlefield. If the enemy is closer to you than 100 yards, then you have to know to aim low because your rifle is sighted at 100 yards. So you have to aim low in order to be able to have an opportunity of hitting the enemy at all, or else the bullets are going to go over their head. If the enemy is downhill, you have to aim low. If the enemy is uphill, you have to aim high. These are all things that you have to consider, and all things that they knew pretty well and were able to manage that a lot of modern people just wouldn't think about. If you're interested in this topic and you want to get more information about it, I am going to link a video from the channel Paper Cartridges, where he really goes into a lot of detail about this. So, look for that link down in the description if you are interested. Now, this doesn't mean that the accuracy of these weapons didn't play a factor in the casualties. It certainly did. You were fairly more likely to hit something with a rifled musket at the ranges that they were fighting from than you would without a rifled musket. But you know what else is also pretty accurate at these ranges is smoothbore muskets. Smoothbore muskets generally did not fire just one ball. They fired what was called buck and ball. That is one large ball with 3 or 6 smaller balls behind it. It kind of acted like a big shotgun. And so if you're firing buck and ball at 80 to 100 yard ranges, your odds of hitting something, or I should say someone, let's not dehumanize it, at these ranges are as good as hitting someone with a rifled musket at these ranges. Now, right now, you might be thinking, okay, communications, coordinations, the accuracy of the soldier, all right, I get all of that. But then why did these guys stand up at all? Why weren't they just always kneeling or lying down when they were engaging in combat if these were the conditions that they had to accept? Well, Civil War muskets are pretty long. And so if you're kneeling, that complicates the process of being able to reload your musket. And then you're only able to get off 2.5 or 2 shots a minute. And remember what I said, volume of fire is important. If the guy that's across from you are able to fire 3 rounds a minute, the little bit of cover that you afford yourself by kneeling down doesn't really help you out that much. And then, if you're lying down, that's just completely, you negate any advantage you have of volume of fire, because at that point, you're usually only able to get off a little more than 1 shot a minute. Now, remember what I said about the geography of the battlefield? A lot of times these guys weren't just standing in completely flat terrain. Where these battles are being fought was not frying pan flat. They had hills and they had valleys and things like that, and the guys oftentimes were taking advantage of this, or they took advantage of cover when they could find it. So they weren't just standing out in the open waiting to get shot at. They were using the advantages that they had. Again, if you had a good commander who was able to see the battlefield situation accurately. So if the accuracy of the weapons didn't play a major role in the casualty figures during the Civil War, what did? Now, the fact of the matter is that the size of these armies was so much larger and the fighting was so much more ferocious than what had come before, and indeed what would come for a long time to come after that. Just to give you an idea, the casualties in the Battle of Shiloh alone on both sides were greater than the size of the entire United States military in the War of 1812. And so that really was the major factor in why the casualties were as large as they were. But there was one piece of military weapons technology that the upgrade did play a major factor, and that is in artillery. Now, artillery is all math. It is all math. If you're making any kind of shot at all, you have to know the math behind the firing arcs. You have to know distances. You have to know all of that stuff. Now, later on in the war, a lot of guys could kind of eyeball this, and they didn't have to do the math so much. But a lot of them were trained to do the math, and they were trained to make these large rather these long distance shots. And the quality of the artillery had improved greatly. Just before the war, you had the introduction of a number of major developments in artillery. And so the first and most important one was the introduction of the Napoleon 12-pounder. Napoleon is the iconic weapon cannon of the Civil War. We say cannon as a general term, but really a cannon is a gun that historically fires on a relatively flat trajectory. And a howitzer is a gun that fires on a relatively arc trajectory. The flat trajectory doesn't get you as much range because if you're firing an iron ball through the air, then the ball drops as quickly as it would as though you are dropping it from that same elevation out of your hand. It's just, traveling forward with all that momentum. So the Napoleon combined the best features of a traditional cannon and a traditional howitzer. And it also was shaped in such a way so that the gun would not expand as much when you fired it. And that also helped to, because metal expands as it heats, and that also helped to maintain the shape, prevented explosions from occurring, so you could maintain a hotter fire for longer, but also help maintain the accuracy of the gun for a lot longer than you would be able to otherwise. So that's the first major innovation. The second one is rifled iron cannon. And so the sort of quintessential gun in this regard is the Parrott gun, which is a much larger artillery piece. And these could fire much further than any other artillery piece could historically. There was a third one that was in there that was used by the United States Army. It was the 3-inch rifle gun. It was a gun that could fire a smaller round than the Parrott gun, but had incredible accuracy for an artillery piece at that time. So these were the three main guns of the Union Army, but the Napoleon was the largest. The Confederacy had more of a mix of arms, and even with the Napoleon and the Parrott and the 3-inch, it took until deep into 1862 to replace all the traditional artillery pieces with these new guns. But when you had them, even on the Confederate side, because they were oftentimes able to capture them, or they were able to create a few of their own, the accuracy of artillery and the devastating effect of artillery is greatly improved. And then on top of that, you had the industrial capacity that you did not have in prior wars to create hundreds and hundreds of these things. The Army of the Potomac, could easily train 300 guns on artillery guns on their opponent at any given time, when in prior conflicts you couldn't get anywhere near this much artillery. as a ratio for your soldiers. You're talking, maybe 60 guns for an army of 20,000 men. In the Civil War, you could easily get double that number of guns for a military outfit of that size. And while artillery only accounted for about 12% of the casualties during the war, it was still about 150% of the casualty ratios that artillery was causing during other conflicts. So can't underestimate that as a factor in why casualty figures, especially the number of dead, was so large. You get hit by an artillery piece, you're pretty dead, usually, unless you're very lucky. So that is something that, where technology is concerned, weapons technology, that did play a major role. But all of that is the technical side of things. Now let's talk about the stories and the examples. And I know this is what you came for. This past summer, I had an opportunity to go to Antietam Battlefield for the first time. Despite the fact that Antietam is the same distance from every place I've lived as Gettysburg is, and I've been to Gettysburg a dozen times, I'd never been to Antietam before, so I got the opportunity and I decided to take it. Something that I have been more convinced of in recent years is that you can't really appreciate a historical event until you've been to the place where it occurred. And so if you have an opportunity to go there, you should always take it. Sometimes people don't have those opportunities. That's understandable, but go if you should. And despite recent attempts by a lot of historians, even a lot of the park rangers at the battlefield, to kind of rehabilitate McClellan's reputation, my visit to Antietam gave me an even lower opinion of McClellan than what I had had before. The recent attempts to rehabilitate McClellan essentially sum up to the notion that, well, he had a plan. Well, everyone has a plan. The question is if the plan is reasonable in its expectations based off of the reality that you see before you, and whether or not it can be properly carried out and executed. For those who aren't familiar, Antietam is the single bloodiest day in American history. There were about 23,000 casualties when you add up everybody on both sides. And the day was made a lot worse, I feel, by the way that McClellan decided to carry out the battle, and the casualty figures are unacceptable for the gains that McClellan was able to make. The terrain that the Battle of Antietam took place on is a relatively narrow strip of land, about 2.5 to 3 miles wide, that is situated between the Potomac River and the much smaller Antietam Creek. There are 3 bridges in the area that cross the Antietam Creek from which the Federal Army was approaching: the upper bridge, the middle bridge, and the lower bridge. McClellan's plan for the day was to take about 2/3 of his army, the 1st Corps, the 2nd Corps, the 6th Corps, and the 12th Corps, and have them cross the upper bridge. They would engage Lee from the north, distracting him, while another corps, the 9th Corps, under Ambrose Burnside, went down to the south, crossed the lower bridge, went into Antietam, and essentially bottled Lee up, cutting him off and surrounding him. And then the remaining corps of the Federal Army, the 5th Corps, was to be held in reserve across the middle bridge. Now, how could this go wrong? Well, as a lot of students of the Civil War are aware, McClellan perpetually feared that he was outnumbered, sometimes greatly outnumbered, by the opposing forces that he faced. Now, a lot of this was because of faulty intelligence, both Federal Army intelligence, but also from the Pinkertons, who were one of the major information sources for the Union Army during the first part of the Civil War. Now, some of this was deliberate subterfuge on the part of the Confederates, but a lot of it was also McClellan coming up for excuses for why he didn't want to take risks and why he was drawn towards inaction. It's made all the more inexcusable by the fact that McClellan had a full, complete, and correct copy of Lee's battle plans as Lee moved into Maryland and intended to go into Pennsylvania. This was Lee's Special Order 191 that miraculously slipped into the hands of the Army of the Potomac not long before the Battle of Antietam. Add on to that the fact that McClellan himself was a railroad executive before the war. His job was in logistics. He was an expert in logistics, sometimes to the great benefit of his own army, but he oftentimes failed to apply this knowledge when looking at the Confederate forces. So while he should have been able to estimate the size of the Confederate forces based off of both the logistical concerns of the forces in the field, but also the capability of the logistics of the Confederate side, again, he never applied that knowledge. So with Lee's full battle orders in hand, he was still more cautious than he might have been otherwise. And despite knowing everything about the planned movements of the Confederate Army and the fact that he should have known that he outnumbered the Confederates almost 2-1 in this battle, he still was not willing to fully commit his forces at any given time. He feared that Lee might secretly have additional forces who were waiting in the wings somewhere, might be able to get around him somehow, might pop out of his bowl of oatmeal in the morning, who knows. Had McClellan fully committed his forces, he could have crushed Lee like a tin can, but he didn't do that. Instead, he sent his corps in piecemeal, first 2 at a time, but then 1 at a time after that. And then he also committed to this broad, sweeping movement to the south that took the Ninth Corps almost completely out of communications range of the rest of his army. The northern end of the Antietam battlefield, from one end of where most of the fighting took place, to the other end, is only a little over a mile long, and that covers the infamous West Woods, the cornfield, the East Woods, and the Bloody Lane, which we'll get more into here in a bit. Now, if you remember back to my video on Robert E. Lee, I had discussed the en echelon assault at Gettysburg and sort of the concept behind en echelon assaults that I kind of laid out a little bit more in my follow-up video, my coda video to that one. And so you might be listening to McClellan's battle plan, at least up in the northern end, and thinking, this is an en echelon assault. But as ill-advised as it might have been, Lee's use of the en echelon at Gettysburg was designed to build force economy, which is a concept that was known during the Civil War, the most effective use of the minimum of forces, and to create force multipliers. McClellan's use of the en echelon at Antietam had the opposite effect. It robbed his forces of force economy and denied them any advantage that their larger numbers might bring if they brought them all to bear at one time. By not fully committing at any given time, he sent the majority of his men through this narrow corridor that allowed the southern side, the Army of Northern Virginia, to utilize their own numbers to maximum effect, shift the forces around as needed, doing all of this while there was still an awful lot of open ground off to Lee's right flank that could have been utilized had he crossed the Middle Bridge instead of attempting this long, sweeping flanking maneuver around Lee's south. But all that is sort of the 30,000-foot view. Let's talk about what actually happened the day of. So the day opened with the 1st Corps and the 12th Corps of the Union Army going in a full frontal assault against the left flank of the Confederate Army up in the north. This is the action that was portrayed in the opening scene of Glory that I had referenced before. These guys just got absolutely pounded that morning. They were up against basically what was a roughly equivalent force, and they were attacking, and the only respite that they had was the fact that the cornfield somewhat obscured their movements a little bit, and these woods that were off to either side of the cornfield helped them out. But it created an equal advantage for the Confederates. After a few hours of that, McClellan ordered his Second Corps into combat. Now, the focus of the fighting that morning, early that morning, was a small white building that was called the Dunker Church. And as each successive wave of the federal assault went in, they were ordered to focus their efforts on that small white building. And here is where McClellan makes another fairly classic mistake that's made by myopic people who were in leadership. The mistake of assuming that all of his commanders on his battlefield, all of his soldiers, shared his perspective both literally and figuratively. When McClellan ordered the Second Corps into action, the orders that they were given were to advance to the small white building. Well, the Second Corps, which at the time was under John Sedgwick, they couldn't see the Dunker Church from where they were. But what they could see was a small collection of white buildings that were off to the one side of where the main Union assault was, that are now known as or then too, were known as the Mumma Farm and the Roulette Farm. So they headed out towards there. And not only did this movement deprive the federal forces in the north of key reinforcements that they needed while they were taking heavy casualties, but it also brought the Second Corps into this small, relatively unwooded basin that is in what is now the middle of the battlefield. The Second Corps cleared out some token resistance after they made their movement towards the farms, but during this action, the Corps commander, General Sedgwick, was wounded and had to be carried off the battlefield. And then one of his division commanders had to take over for him. So already within this situation where you don't have good coordination, you now also don't have good continuity of command, and that leads to further lack of coordination. Additionally, the Second Corps had a number of regiments that had just been raised and mustered in, as it's called. Some of these less than a month prior to the battle. So they didn't have the time for the drill that was needed. They didn't have any combat experience to speak of whatsoever. The Sunken Lane itself is a trench-like formation that rests at the bottom of the trough of two hillsides. The hillside on the Confederate side is bare, gradual sloping. The hillside on the Union side has some wooded areas to it and is far more abrupt. There's not much space between you and the Bloody Lane itself whenever you go over the hill, whenever you crest the hill on the Union side. In some spaces, it's only about 20 yards or so. Unfortunately, the Federal units that started heading towards the Bloody Lane, once that order had been given, those that were deployed to the section where you would have the least warning when cresting the hillside, were also those who had the least experience in battle at that time, even though they were deployed much closer to the center of the line than their comrades. They had the least experience. If someone had time to think this out, they may have reorganized, but they just went ahead and gave the order to go over. If they'd had the training, if they'd had the experience, then these Union regiments may have deployed skirmishers out ahead so that way they knew what was coming. But they didn't. And the moment that a number of these regiments crested the hillside, the Confederates opened fire. A lot of these guys literally had no clue what was happening before they were on the ground, and entire companies were completely wiped out in this first volley of fire. As the battle progressed, the Union sent more forces in, but not knowing what was up in front of them, not having any idea what was going on, they crested the hillside and were shot down just as surely as their comrades had been before them. Then comes the Irish Brigade. Unlike a lot of the units that had preceded them in the battle, the Irish Brigade had real combat experience, and so they understood both the tactical ideas that they had been trained with, but also how to apply those in the battlefield. After meeting some initial resistance when they were coming out of a cornfield, it wasn't the cornfield, it was a different cornfield. One of the North Carolina units moved up and took some shots at the Irish Brigade as they were emerging from this cornfield. Smart on their part, because even though they were giving up the cover, they were able to surprise the Irish Brigade, who did not see what was coming on the other side of the cornfield, caused quite a few casualties. The Irish formed up on the opposite side of the hill crest from the sunken road, the Bloody Lane, and they formed into something of a sort of an inverted wedge shape, so that way they could concentrate their fire. And they moved over the hillside, running, sprinting the entire time, because they knew that the weapons that they were armed with, these outdated smoothbore muskets, they were one of the last units in the Army that still had these, they knew that these were far more effective at a closer range. And so they didn't take any shots at the crest or while they were running down. They waited until they got to within about 50 feet of the Confederate line. The Confederates were only able to get off a couple of shots while the Irish were running at them, and they blasted away with this buck and ball. And at these ranges, as I'd said before, this is murderous, much more so than the rifled muskets that the Confederate side was using. So while the Irish did not carry the position, they did way more damage to the Confederates than any other unit that had preceded them into the battle. And this wasn't because of superior fighting spirit or any of these other things that you might hear about, or Irish determination. It's because they knew what they were doing. They understood the tactics of the Civil War. They understood the situation they were in. They were able to take advantage of that. So they didn't carry the position. They were forced to retreat. But after that, Caldwell's brigade, which was kind of hanging off to the left side of the Irish, finally got into the battle, not because of Caldwell, but rather because Division Commander Israel Richardson rode up and personally ordered these guys into the fight. He was trying to get orders to Caldwell. Caldwell, according to various accounts, was reluctant, shall we say, to actually get into the battle. And so Richardson took personal command, ordered these guys in. At that point in the battle, because the Confederate morale was wavering, because they had taken so many losses from the Irish coming in and using the tactics effectively, an order to refuse the line, which is to say, move the line into an angle so that you can fend off a flanking attack, was possibly subconsciously, deliberately misunderstood by one of the Confederate regimental commanders into a retreat. And so they pulled out, and once that starts, once you see guys retreating around you, you're going to start to retreat too. And when that happened, the Bloody Lane position completely turned on the Confederates, because, as I've mentioned before, the hillside leading into it is gradual, sloping, completely bare. You have no cover, so the Federals were able to blast away at those guys who were retreating and then get perpendicular to the angle and blast down the entire length of Bloody Lane, and that's how they finally were able to dislodge Confederate forces from this position. The Bloody Lane itself is about 4/10 of a mile, and it was said that by the end of that, you could walk from one end of the lane to the other end of the lane, and never once would your feet touch the ground, because you would just be stepping over the corpses of Confederate soldiers. But here we see a unit that is smartly using tactics, smartly using the experience they learned, not just going in lines and shooting from a distance. They learned through combat experience how to manage this situation, were able to manage it a lot better than what had come before them. But, again, this whole thing is a monument to poor coordination, poor communication. The communication coordination itself is poor, but then the kind of limitations of Civil War communication and coordination. So then we get down to the southern part of the battlefield and the action at the lower bridge. Now, the federal forces that were sent down there, the Ninth Corps, did not even get into position until later on in the morning. They didn't start out at that point of the battlefield. They had to move down there. And the position was not scouted out in advance. By this point, the Confederates had a pretty good idea that there might be some sort of movement to their south. And so they deployed a small force down there of about 400 men. Now, 400 men against an entire corps of about 11,000, this should be a pretty easy fight, you would think, right? Well, as I said, the position was not scouted out in advance. The Burnside Bridge is an incredibly narrow bridge. You can only get about 4 guys shoulder to shoulder across it at any given time. On the opposite end, where the Confederates were situated, is a steep hillside. And so these 400 guys were able to hold off this entire Union Corps for several hours while they tried to cross the bridge. And on the Union end, the only cover is a stone wall off to one side, sort of a low stone wall, and then some woods off to the other side. Now, despite this maneuver being the key piece to what McClellan was trying to do, Burnside wasn't actually present there until several hours after all of this started going down. Burnside was actually in charge of an entire wing of the Federal Army, and so he was occupied up north trying to coordinate his men who were going into battle up there, and had to give command of the Ninth Corps over to one of his division commanders, Cox. It took several hours for Burnside to get down to where his corps was, and once he did get there, he ordered his men to look for fords along other spots of the river. He managed to get a couple of brigades across. They were able to sweep the Confederates out of the way, and then the rest of the corps was able to cross after that. So it's somewhat unfortunate that this is called the Burnside Bridge now, because the whole thing really wasn't Burnside's fault, and once he got there, he rectified the situation pretty quickly. But a lot of folks who have never been there ask, well, why they need to look for fords at all? Why didn't they just cross wherever? You know, the Antietam Creek doesn't look very formidable when you're looking at pictures of it or when you're just looking at a map. And the answer to that is that on the day I was there, the creek was running about waist height. Now, I am taller than the average Civil War soldier, and it's said to have been running a little bit higher than that on the day of the battle. So this probably would have been about chest height for most of the men at its deepest point. The banks themselves are a little steep, and they are pretty muddy. So once you send 1 or 2 lines of guys across that, it just becomes a mud pit. So that really wasn't an option either. But because of, again, poor command, poor communication, poor coordination, this grand maneuver that McClellan had planned did not go off. A.P. Hill's guys were able to get into position, block the Ninth Corps' movement, and the battle was essentially over from there. Now, as I had said before, you had this middle bridge that was on the far right flank of where the Northern Confederate position, and the Fifth Corps was directly across from that bridge. So why didn't, at the very least, they send the Fifth Corps across that bridge? They could have potentially also sent the Ninth Corps across that bridge. But, you know, that's a counterfactual. It would have been a much more direct route into Sharpsburg, but McClellan wanted to attempt this trickery. Because he hadn't considered the factors of command and communication coordination, he didn't. The plan didn't go as he wanted. But there may still have been an opportunity to cut off at least a decent-sized portion of Lee's army. But McClellan briefly contemplated sending the Fifth Corps across the Middle Bridge and into Sharpsburg, and then he was talked out of it by Fifth Corps Commander Fitzporter, who took advantage of McClellan's cautiousness and said to McClellan, well, gee, General, you know, we are the last reserve of the army, and Lee might be planning anything, so we better just hang back here, and you better not send us in. And McClellan went for this because it went along with what he wanted to believe about his situation. But because McClellan failed to understand the challenges of coordinating a vast Civil War army, and he failed to master the principles that we're talking about of command, coordination, and communication, Antietam ended up a giant missed opportunity for the Federal Army.